Lewis Art for the Ring Magazine. Delighted today to be joined with the Ring Magazine's very own Keith Idec here on a nice Thursday afternoon for me, Thursday morning for yourself. Look, appreciate the time, Keith. Yeah, it's been a busy couple of weeks of boxing, and a busy couple of weeks going ahead. But yeah, I guess first things first, how's things? How are you?
I'm doing well, man. I appreciate it. How are things over there in the UK, right?
All good, mate. All good. Nice, quiet month of boxing after, but it's going to be crazy the next couple weeks. But yeah, look, I guess we'll jump into it. First thing first. We're currently sort of midway through the press tour of Canelo against Crawford. We had the Saudi presser, we had the New York one, which was quite lively, and we finished the leg tomorrow in Las Vegas. I guess sort of just touching initially on that press tour. Not much really to take from the Saudi one, but the New York one was definitely very interesting. A lot of bit of back and forth, and obviously the face off with the little push. But I guess with the start of the promotion for this fight, which is obviously a mega fight, how have you found it? Is it something I guess you've enjoyed?
Yeah, I mean the as you mentioned, the Riyadh press conference was rather uneventful. I think these guys are just at the highest level. They have a lot of respect for each other, and I think what happened at the New York press conference was more WWE type of stuff. To be honest with you, I don't think there's any real dislike among the two fighters. I think they're the ultimate businessmen. They realize they have business to do on September 13th, and they're just going to do that. There's the push and all that. I don't know. I mean, looked a little contrived to me, frankly, but they had some fun with the fans because that was a unique thing that they had there in New York. The Fanatics Fest, it was a second annual Fanatics Fest in New York, drew tens of thousands of people over the course of 3 days, and that was the final day of it. So there were a lot of non-boxing fans in the building, and of course, you want to reach those people with a fight of this magnitude. So that was, from that standpoint, promotionally, it worked very well. I think they were just playing it up for the cameras a little bit, trying to get the crowd involved. Crawford was playing to the crowd a little bit, saying that I'm going to send you home crying, and he started going like, like he's playing around a little bit. And it was fine, but I don't really think there was any genuine animosity there between the two guys.
Do you feel like, especially when we do get it though, like the fans in general, like the purists, they don't take much from that, but fans sometimes for a fight like that, where it's you've got two guys like Crawford and Canelo who they aren't the they're not going to start throwing tables at each other, but they sometimes it feels like we need something to feed off, and when you had that little push, you had that little tense sort of moment between the two, that's something to sort of like that gets people excited in a sense because they can feed off that in a sense.
Especially when you're doing three press conferences within a week. Sometimes these press conferences are even in a more condensed period of time, and it becomes monotonous for the people involved, even though you're trying to hit different markets. And of course, they're going to Las Vegas tomorrow on Friday to wrap up the press tour. So it could kind of start to feel for the people that are involved that they're just going through the motions a little bit because you have to do this before you get into camp for the fight. So it spiced it up a little bit, as you said, and maybe drew some attention from more mainstream sports fans as opposed to diehard boxing fans. Look, diehard boxing fans have wanted to see this fight now. There's been momentum building toward it for a while. In the beginning, it wasn't really something that I felt like I wanted to see. And as time has, gone on here, there's really a lot of anticipation about this fight. So it's what the fans want, it's what the consumers want. And now there are a lot of people who think Terence Crawford has a legitimate chance to win. The odds reflect that. And people are getting excited about it as we get closer to the fight.
It's interesting you say that there because I think I was probably in that camp of. I mean, the first sort of talk with it was after the Errol Spence fight. We're talking about sort of jumping up and fighting Canelo, and it was more a case of sort of it was a bit crazy to sort of think about it. Crawford sort of jumping up to what, not even what, 20 pounds, more than 20 pounds to fight Canelo, who's the undisputed super middleweight champion. But I mean, like, yeah, you must share that opinion, I guess, that as time's gone on, you saw the Madrimov fight. And you saw, I guess, Canelo's recent performances against Berlanga, Skull. Would you say it's built up anticipation? Because, fast forward 2 years of when it was first discussed, it's a more interesting fight now, would you say?
I think that's absolutely true. And I spoke to Bob Arum a couple of days ago, and Bob had, when we first spoke about this fight a few years ago, he was even Crawford's promoter when this first was broached a little bit and wasn't really all that serious then. But back then, Bob, who has seen it all over the course of the last 60 years in boxing, he didn't take it seriously. He was like, Crawford can't fight Canelo. There's a 21-pound difference. It's silly to even discuss. And now Bob told me that he thinks not only is Crawford going to win, he's going to win a convincing decision,
Wow.
or potentially knock out Canelo Alvarez, which is something that a lot of people are starting to say. I don't see that happening just because maybe the best asset that Canelo has had over the course of his 20-year career has been his chin. We really haven't seen him badly hurt, Lewis, since the first round of that Jose Cotto fight. Now, he's been affected by punches in other fights, particularly against Triple G, and he hit it pretty well. But we haven't seen him noticeably hurt where he was, because he was pretty badly hurt by that left hook by Jose Cotto. That was 15 years ago. He was only 19 years old. And he's fought some big guys and some hard punchers since then and hasn't budged. The punches that you don't see or the punches you don't expect coming, of course, are the ones that oftentimes hurt you or stop you. So Crawford could have an advantage in that respect, but I don't see Crawford knocking him out. But there are a lot of people who've been around boxing. I've been around it a pretty long time, but Bob's been around it more than twice the amount of time that I have. And he thinks there's a possibility, at least, that Crawford could knock out Canelo Alvarez. So, and he's not saying it to drum up interest in the fight. He doesn't have any vested interest in the fight. He's not involved in it in any capacity. So he's not trying to say things outrageously to get people interested in the fight. He could not care less what happens in the fight, honestly. So he has no stake in the game, and he said that. And there's other matchmakers and promoters and managers and fighters themselves who believe that's a possibility. So I think that lends to the intrigue going into September 13th.
It's interesting to say that because I think that the consensus from a lot of people would also be that Crawford probably has to make the fight a little bit boring to win the fight, maybe box on the outside, sort of use his movement. Would you sort of subscribe to that? Would you buy that opinion that, look, if Crawford, his best way to win is really by potentially making it a boring fight?
Yeah, I think he has to be careful with Canelo's power because, Crawford hasn't been hurt a lot either. I mean, he was not probably. He should have been knocked down against Kavalauskas. That should have counted as a knockdown. But he's also shown a good chin against some good punchers, just in smaller weight classes. But I thought he was more careful than usual against Madrimov. Now you're going up two more weight classes against a guy who can really punch. So I think he has to, just intellectually, he has to be smart about it, and he has to be careful. He's not going to go in there and bang it out with Canelo Alvarez, I wouldn't think. But the way he's talking makes it seem like he's going to fight on the inside. So that could be a psychological ploy. Who knows what he'll actually do? But I think you'd have to be mindful of Canelo's power, especially to the body. Crawford's a great body puncher himself, but I think he just has to be careful with a guy like Canelo because I could see Crawford being up on the cards, maybe even by the wide margins that Bob Arum and others have mentioned, and then Canelo catches him with something just because he's a big puncher, man, and it's and he's accustomed to taking punches at that weight. I think Crawford will go about it in a very measured way because I think that's the smartest way he can go about it, and that's probably his path to victory. But who knows? That's why even Crawford himself said the other day, he did an interview with Kopp the other day, and we put it on the YouTube channel, and Coppinger asked him, he said, well, do you feel like you can take Canelo's power? And he's like, well, we're going to find out. That's what the fight's about, right? That's why we fight. So even he knows that there's a measure of the unknown going into this fight.
And I guess it might seem like a silly question, but when you look at the magnitude of this fight, a lot of people have been calling it the fight of the decade. You look at Netflix being involved, at Allegiant Stadium. Would you believe that this is potentially the biggest fight we've seen since Mayweather Pacquiao?
I think because of the platform. You're not asking people to plunk down. In this case, if this fight were on pay-per-view, they probably would have asked $100 for it, US dollars anyway. That doesn't play over there in the UK. You ask them for £100, tell you what to do there, of course. But this would have been a $100 fight on pay-per-view in the US market. So to have it available to everyone that subscribes to Netflix, and most people have Netflix subscriptions, 300 million plus global customers, it's just a great opportunity for boxing, and you just hope that the fight captivates the imagination of some non-boxing fans or some casual boxing fans where they start watching boxing with more regularity. And then the numbers are good enough on Netflix where they consider investing in boxing more, which is what they've done now. I'm not saying they're going to have like a Showbox level series on Netflix or anything like that, because, I don't know what their appetite is for boxing. But now, based on the numbers that they did for the Jake Paul-Mike Tyson fight, which was an unusual event, obviously, but they now have invested in boxing more. They're doing the Katie Taylor Amanda Serrano fight on July 11th, which also did a massive audience back in November. So they're more about the tent pole events. I understand that they're not going to get involved in boxing, let's say the way that Showtime or HBO were once upon a time, but it is a great opportunity for the sport to try to expand its audience, and we really need to capitalize. What you really hope is that this fight isn't a dud aesthetically, because if it is, that will turn people off, and we don't need that.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that about Netflix because, especially, I'm sure you know, in the US market, the broadcasting landscape has changed so much in the last sort of decade. And especially now we do see sort of Netflix involved Prime as well, PBC. But do you think there is ever a world where sort of Netflix do ease up on, we do see, I'm not saying, your regular, your regular shows, but I'm saying like you might see maybe sort of like 4 or 5 fights a year instead of your sort of your typical one or two. Like, do you ever think there's a world where like there's enough fights for happen to Netflix to sort of have like a quite a sort of a regular feature on Netflix, regular-ish feature, if that makes sense?
You would certainly hope so, Lewis, but the finances have to work out for both sides,
Mm.
because Netflix would have to invest a lot of money to bring. Of course, there aren't going to be too many fights as big as Canelo Crawford, but let's just say a level below that, really good fights that would do reasonably well on pay-per-view in the
Mhm.
United States and the UK. Netflix would have to invest the kind of money in those types of events to make it worthwhile for the promoters, and this maybe Turkey Al Sheikh, the Riyadh season, whichever entity it might be, for it to be worthwhile for it to be on Netflix, because it has to make sense for them, because they're not going to regularly put fights on that would produce revenue on pay-per-view and not get the return that they need from Netflix to do those fights on Netflix.
Yeah, so it's definitely an interesting one. And actually something, Keith, you've been covering boxing for quite a while, and it was something I wanted to get your opinion on. I mean, it was filmed a few months ago, but obviously released this week a podcast with Tom Brady, Dana White, Shaquille O'Neal, Canelo, and Crawford. And there was a little bit of back and forth between Canelo and Crawford. And the Ring magazine posted a clip of basically Canelo saying to Crawford, "Look, I don't think you've boxed anyone of elite opposition." Crawford's response I thought was interesting. He mentioned Victor Postal and Ricky Burns, which were two, I guess, interesting names. They weren't the first I'd think of when it comes to Crawford's resume, but that sparked the debate of sort of has Crawford boxed anyone of an elite level? In your opinion, where do you view this? Like, would you view even the Spence fight as elite level? Although people may say, look, that wasn't the best version of Spence. Like, how do you view sort of that opinion that was made by Canelo?
I think it's fair to say that was not the best version of Spence that we had ever seen when he fought Crawford. That's not Crawford's fault. I don't really understand it from Crawford's perspective in the way that he has gone about sort of downplaying Spence's resume and his qualifications for the Hall of Fame. He said he wouldn't be a Hall of Famer. I don't know that it's necessarily smart to say that, because he's the most recognizable, accomplished name on his resume. So I think most people now I don't know if he's saying that to take a dig at Errol Spence. I'm not really sure, because he certainly says that he respects Errol Spence and he has no animosity toward him. And I think that's true of Spence as well. So I don't know why he would say that, because that was the fight. Look, there were two fights when he became fully unified champions. If you're going to sit there and not you, if anyone's going to sit there and
Yeah.
tell me that Spence is not a more credible fighter than Julius and Dongo, which is how he became the
Yeah.
fully unified champion in the junior welterweight division, well, that's not really a conversation we should have. Ricky Burns was a very good fighter. Postal at the time was very good, and that wasn't an easy fight. Not the version of Postal that we've seen the last couple of years. I mean, he was in the physical prime of his career, so that was a different fight. But if you ask me, look, he's the one fighting. He's obviously entitled to his opinion of it. But if you were simply to look at his record, the best fighter that he has beaten is Errol Spence. So I
Mm.
thought it was a peculiar response as well. But I think maybe he said it because it has to go in line with what he's saying about Spence not being a Hall of Famer, which is an odd thing to say also, because Spence will be a Hall of Famer, probably a first ballot Hall of Famer, because he's only lost to Crawford, who's one of the best fighters of this generation. He was he needed only one belt to become the fully unified welterweight champion himself, and he beat some good fighters. He beat Sean Porter. He never fought Thurman, unfortunately, but he beat some very. He went to England to beat Kell Brook. That was a huge win for him. The Porter fight was a dog fight, but Errol Spence won the fight. You know, he had some mandatories and some optionals and defenses in between where he didn't beat the best guys, but he beat some very, very, very good fighters. And I think the second best fighter, frankly, uh, that Crawford beat was Sean Porter, who gave Crawford a tough fight before he stopped him.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's an interesting conversation. Because as I say, like it also goes on the on the other hand as he's only fighting who he can put in front of him, and it's fair to say, especially in Crawford's portion of his career, where sort of a lot of the big fights with PBC, he weren't aligned with them. He was a top rank. So do you think it's also a case of sort of putting the that was a different today's a different world, but back then in Crawford's not prime, but sort of back then it was a different time of when you do compare, I guess, that sort of resume for him, if that makes sense.
We would have rather have seen him fight Spence and Porter before he did, maybe before they fought each other. Um, but that's the way it happened. He's older than Spence, so it's not like he fought an old Spence. It's just, of course, all of the things that happened to Errol Spence along the way made him a diminished version of what he once was. He had a detached retina, the car accident, he was damaged in a car accident. He was never really the same as he was, but he still hadn't lost, and he was a unified welterweight champion. He didn't look good I think it was a combination of Crawford being at his peak and fighting as well as he possibly could on the biggest night of his career, and Spence being a diminished version of what he once was. Maybe that's really what Crawford means when he says that. He's not really conveying it that way, but maybe that's what he means. And if that's what he means, hopefully he would clarify that, because saying that Ricky Burns was better than Errol Spence, I mean, I don't think many people believe that.
Yeah, yes, I definitely agreed with yourself there. Just quickly moving on, actually, I wanted to talk. It's fast approaching, obviously, the third Ring Magazine show on July 12th. Sort of, I guess, a co-headline you could say with Shakur Zepeda and Balanga and Hamza Shiraz over in Queens in New York. Yeah, I guess it's fast approaching. You're looking forward to, I guess not, I was going to say this Saturday, but in a couple of weeks' time when we do see the Ring come back to New York.
I am. Yeah, I'm looking for the two fights at the top of the card. Obviously, are very good. They're contrast of styles in the Shakur Stevenson William Zepeda fight. Let's see how Shakur handles his pressure. Some people think that William Zepeda that he's tailor made for Shakur to pick him apart. Um, Shakur's a 12-1 favorite. I think the odds are a little wide, but Shakur's an elite level fighter, and now he needs to beat Zepeda in the way that the odds reflect that he will, to make the kind of statement that he says that he's going to make. He says that he's going to stop Zepeda. So it's going to be interesting to see how much he fights from the inside. Um, I don't think there's going to be as small a ring as people might think from what I've been led to believe over the last few days. I don't think it's going to be some bandbox ring, because I know Turkey has made mention of him wanting a smaller ring so there's less room for the fighters to operate. It's my understanding from what I was told yesterday that this is going to be a standard sized ring. So it's not going to be some sort of bandbox where, like the Paulie Malignaggi Miguel Cotto ring, when you could have basically put it in your living room for the most part. But so I don't think that that's going to be as much of a factor as people might anticipate. But so I'm very much looking forward to seeing that fight, because Shakur, needs that type of win to stamp himself in the lightweight division. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And then you want to see what Hamza Shiraz has as a super middleweight. People think that, and he certainly said this, squeezing that 6'4" frame down to 160 pounds definitely depleted him. He wasn't fighting up to his capabilities because he drained himself so much to make weight. So let's see. He's a puncher too. And Berlanga's been down a couple of times against Caceres and, of course, against Canelo. So let's see how he fares against a real super middleweight who can punch. There's so much at stake for Shiraz, because Turkey has come out and said that a potential, if Canelo beats Crawford, he could be his next opponent in the UK. That could also be Chris Eubank Jr. So there's just so much at stake in this fight for Shiraz, and Berlanga can't afford a loss either. And he's fighting kind of sort of in his hometown. He calls Brooklyn his hometown. So he's very nearby there in Queens. So there's a lot of juice in that fight. But the fight, honestly, that I'm looking the most forward to, Lewis, is the Imam Katayev David Morrell fight, because I just think that can't miss from an action standpoint. It's flown under the radar a little bit because people aren't all that from even hardcore boxing fans aren't all that familiar with Katayev. Of course, Morrell lost his last fight against Benavidez, and I give Morrell a ton of credit for coming back in his next fight in what's a high risk, low reward proposition against Imam Katayev because no one knows who he is, and it's a dangerous fight. Now, some people say, oh, he didn't look that great in his last fight in Sydney back in March. He didn't. He won. He went the distance for the first time. Didn't look particularly great in that fight against an opponent who's obviously worse than Morrell. But he's in there with a real puncher who's going to come forward and throw a lot of punches. He's a pretty technically sound guy as well. So I'm really looking forward to that fight because it's a high stakes fight for guys with Morrell only has 11 fights on his professional record and Katayev only has 10. If there weren't so much money involved, this type of fight doesn't happen at this stage of both fighters' career. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, and we can touch on Morel Katayev now because I remember Eddie was talking and he described it. He said like that weren't it, and I can speak for probably a lot of boxing fans. It weren't really a fight anyone was really thinking about. When you see it happen, you think like, wow, that's a really good fight. But yeah, it definitely makes for a really interesting fight, as you said. I mean, when I look at the build, that's probably the one I'm definitely gonna sit down and watch that one. Um, but yeah, just touching on just sort of firstly touching on Shakur there. Do you feel like there is pressure? There's a lot more pressure than normal for the Zepeda fight because when you see Turkey Al Sheikh come out and say, look, he doesn't want the Tom and Jerry fight. I think when he comes out and makes those statements, sort of the first fighters that people look to would be a guy like Shakur who has a very defensively sound style. So when you do hear things like that, do you feel like there's pressure more than ever for him to perform in an exciting fashion on July 12th?
There is more pressure on him. I just don't know how he's going to respond to said pressure because ultimately he has to win the fight, right? Yes, you want to entertain, but you have to win the fight too because if he goes in there and gets outside of himself and fights a type of fight that benefits Zepeda more than it benefits him, and he gets clipped with a shot and gets knocked out, well, then everyone says, oh, Shakur wasn't as good as everyone said, and look what happened when he fought a guy who pressured him and threw a lot of punches. So it's a balancing act, and I think Crawford pretty much. I think what Crawford said, I think it was during the first press conference in Riyadh the other day, he said something to the effect of, no one is going to tell me how to fight. And I think he meant Turkey. Obviously, that was directed at Turkey and anyone else. Just because you're paying for the fight doesn't mean I'm going to dictate my strategy according to what you say. Now, when you're paying for the fights, you're free to say whatever you want. If you're frustrated, if you're not satisfied, you can say what you want. But ultimately, I think the fighters are going to perform in a way that suits their skill sets and makes them most comfortable. Maybe Shakur will fight a little bit more in the pocket and use his legs a little less because he sees some things in Zepeda's aggression where sometimes he's a little reckless in his aggression, where he might feel he can pick him apart and counter him on the inside. Maybe that's what he'll do. But I don't feel like he's going to, I guess ultimately to answer your question, I don't think that he's going to get too outside of himself trying to appease anyone who's trying to pressure him to fight in a particular way.
Do you feel like the hands could be an issue for Shakur? He's gone on record to say sort of the issue with his hands, and even like a fight like Padley, where he had to probably be the aggressor in that fight. I remember Hearn also said, look, he landed a lot of punches there, and it probably wasn't particularly great on his hands. For a guy who's 27, non-punches, do you feel like that does play a concern? Because you never really know until you're sort of in the fight.
Of course, you don't know, maybe he catches Zepeda on the top of his head or something and it affects him during the fight. I mean, we won't know that type of thing until fight night. But yeah, I mean, when a fighter has hand concerns, you just hope that they are going through the types of therapies that and getting cortisone shots and those types of things that can help dull the pain on fight night. You hope they're doing that in a way where it'll enable them to get through 12 rounds if need be as comfortably as possible. But yeah, I mean, I don't know that his hand issues are as bad as say Floyd Mayweather's over the course of his career, but it's an issue. It's an issue, and it could, if you again, let's just say he lands on the top of Zepeda's head, or he lands the wrong way, and he's a one-handed fighter for 9 rounds. Well, it's going to be hard to beat a guy like that with one hand.
And just on Shiraz and Berlanga as well, how do you think a fight like this plays out where there's so much at stake for the winner, but also a lot of question marks for whoever loses this fight? Because, Turkey went on record to say, look, I would like Shiraz to face someone like Canelo, and I know Berlanga's pushing for a potential Canelo rematch in his world. But yeah, I guess how do you think a fight plays out where there is so stake on the line for the winner, but then the losers really, there is that concern because, Belanga's come off the Canelo fight, Shearer's come off the Adames fight. So do you feel like it plays into, I guess, a more exciting fight potentially?
I think it'll be from the beginning. I think Berlanga is going to go after Shiraz. So I think there's going to be some action, and Shiraz obviously can punch as well. So I think there's going to be some interesting rounds early in the fight. I don't think I know Berlanga has said this to whoever will listen. He's not fighting Canelo again. There's no public appetite for that fight. There's no demand for it. No one's paying for it. So I don't know if he's just saying it to troll people. I'm not really sure, but there is absolutely no reason for Berlanga to fight Canelo again. But if he loses to Shiraz, I mean that's tough because he will have lost 2 of his last 3 fights, and then he's trying to get other. I think he knows that he's not going to. Frankly, if in a quiet moment, I think he knows that he's not going to fight Canelo again. But let's say Canelo loses to Crawford, or he's not going to fight a lot of these young guns in the super middleweight division. There are interesting fights available in the super middleweight division for Berlanga. Jamal Charlo has now come back to fight. Of course, Plant lost, so that removed one of the really interesting potential fights for Berlanga from his list of potential opponents. But there's a lot at stake for him, and there is a lot at stake for Shiraz, even though he officially doesn't have a loss on his record. He lost to Carlos Adames. So in the court of public opinion, that would kind of be 2 losses in a row, although officially on his record, he's undefeated. So there's a lot at stake for both guys. But I think if Shiraz were to lose the fight, I think he would be given the benefit of the doubt in the sense that he's moving up. He could have fought a lot easier opponent than Edgar Berlanga going into his first super middleweight fight after struggling so much in his last middleweight fight. So I think he deserves a lot of credit. While he's being paid well, of course, he deserves a lot of credit for fighting a banger in his first fight in a new weight class.
Definitely, and it's one I can't wait for. I can't wait to be in New York in a couple of weeks' time. But Keith, look, always appreciate taking time to speak to me. Always good to get your opinion, breakdown on some exciting fights across the pond in the next couple of months. But as always, appreciate you taking the time. I'm sure it won't be too long since we catch up sometime soon.
My pleasure, Lewis. Look forward to seeing you in New York.
Pleasure. See you there, mate. Top man. Thank you.
Yeah.